Good evening. Did you know that the city of Denton in the 1880s had its very own thriving African American community? At that time, it was known as Freemanstown, and it existed until sometime in the 1920s. I'm Delia Parker Mims, and you're watching Access to Justice. Today, we are going to talk about Denton's lost gem, its Quakertown, so to speak. And I have two guests with me today who can speak on the African American community of Denton. To my left, I have Miss Alma Clark, who has been a longtime resident of Denton and whose husband was actually a member of Quakertown. And I believe his family home is one of the houses in the museum that Denton has. And to my right, we have Miss Kim Cupit, who is the Curator of Collections for Denton County and the Office of, what is the Office of Culture and Heritage?
Of History and Culture.
History and Culture, okay. And you currently house some of the artifacts from Denton, including some of the Quakertown?
Yes, we do. We have the museum at the courthouse on the square, but we also have the historical park, which has a Quakertown house that tells the story and history of Quakertown in it.
Okay, so we're talking about the African American community in Denton County today in honor of Black History Month on this last day of February. And we're going to start with Miss Cupit because you have some information regarding the actual history and some of the artifacts that people can go to and examine if they wanted to learn about the history of Quakertown. And I'm calling it Quakertown, but when it was established in the 1880s, it actually was known by a different name. Is that correct?
The first community was established around 1875, which was Freedmantown. And then in the 1880s, many of the residents of Freedmantown then moved to the area that's now Quakertown. When Quakertown was dissolved, when it was forced to move, some of the houses remained, and we have, the Office of History and Culture has possession of two of those houses. One of them opened several years ago as the Quakertown African American Museum, and then another house is in the process of being moved this year.
Okay, so the houses that you have are in possession of, is one of those Mrs. Clark's father's house, or her husband's house?
Both of them are related to Mrs. Clark's family. The current house that we have was owned by Ross Hembry, who was her husband's stepfather. He had moved it from Quakertown and used it as a rental, and was actually just a few houses down from where he lived and where her husband lived. And then the other house that we're moving is the Woods house, which belonged to her husband's uncle, who on his mother's side. So both of them are related to Mrs. Clark and their family.
Okay, interesting. Now, when we talk about Quakertown, now that was what we refer to it as, we're talking about the area, I guess, known now as Southeast Denton, somewhere around MLK and TWU, or where they meet?
Well, Quakertown is actually the area which is now Quakertown Park, which used to be Civic Center Park, called Civic Center Park, but was renamed around 2007 to Quakertown Park. And that was, so it's the area that's encompassed by Oakland, Bell, Withers, and McKinney Street. So that area that, we have Arts and Jazz Festival and different events, and where the swimming pool is, used to be the thriving community of Quakertown.
Okay. And the history museum that you are the curator of, where is that located?
We're located on Carroll Avenue, in between on Mulberry Street. It's where the historical park is. There's 3 structures right there, and about to be more we're developing in the park. So, it's still close to downtown Denton, but certainly not close to where Quakertown was.
Right. Now, on Carroll Street, is it by that courthouse that was on Carroll Street, or is that where one of the houses
is? It's right across from the Carroll Administration Building that's on the corner of Carroll and Mulberry. And it's where the community market meets, if anybody, during the summer, if anybody's familiar with that. But that's where the houses are.
Okay. Well, now let's get into exactly what we mean by Freemantown and Quakertown and the history of Denton in the thriving African American community that once was established in those areas. Ms. Clark, you are often called upon to talk about the history of Denton because you've been here for several years.
52 years.
52 years. And as Miss Cupit has indicated, in your family, through your husband's lineage, he had the house that was built when Quakertown was established. Was that where your husband was born? Did he grow up in that house?
He grew up, well, he lived in that house when he was about 6 years old. He grew up in Argyle, but when he got old enough to come to school, his mother had moved to Denton and remarried because his father had passed away, and they lived in Quakertown from the time he was 6 years old until the Quakertown was dissolved. And he was about 21 years old then when that happened.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Quakertown and what that was and what that meant. And both of you guys, I'm sure, have a lot of information about that. It was a community established, I guess, about 1875. It was a black community in this area. What types of businesses were in that community when it was established?
Once it got over into Quakertown, they had a lodge, cafe, laundry, a doctor's office, a pool hall, a barber shop, and they even had a nursery school for the parents that worked, mostly at the college, at the University of, at North Texas at that time, and TW, but it was called the CIA. And the CIA stands for the College of Industrial Arts. Okay,
so they even had their own daycare back then. So in 1875 and through the 1920s, daycare has always been an issue.
Right, right. The family person there her name was Skinner, and those parents that had to work, the children weren't old enough to go to school. She had the daycare.
Okay, so it was relatively self-contained community.
Yes. They had a tailor shop also there.
Would you describe it as prosperous for the time period?
Yes, very much so. And they were very proud that they were able to have their own business.
Okay. And as far as education, wasn't there a school built in that area?
There was a school that was built in the area.
When was that built?
I don't exactly know. Kim may know.
Yeah, the first school was established in 1875 and moved to Quakertown in the 1880s. So it was called the Fred Douglass School.
Okay. After Frederick?
After Frederick Douglass, yeah.
Okay. And I believe there is a Douglass School, isn't there?
It's now Fred Moore School.
Fred Moore?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was renamed Fred Moore in 1949.
Okay, so you have this black community where you have your own businesses, homes, daycare. They were providing, they did not have a hospital. So
but they had a doctor.
They had a doctor. Was that a black doctor, or was it?
His name was Dr. Moten, and he was originally from Texas, but was educated on the East Coast and came here and lived here from about 1907 to 1920.
Okay, and then later on they had the Frederick Douglass School. What happened to that school? Did they ever get to attend it?
They did attend the Fred Douglass School. It was a lot of people moved to Quakertown because of the school. Denton was known for the school for the African American community. It was incredibly prosperous, a really known school, and provided a really good education. But in 1913, the Sunday before they were supposed to start school for the following Monday for the school year, it mysteriously burned down.
There was a mysterious fire.
There was a mysterious fire. The stove was not lit. There was no electricity. They do not know what caused it, but the students then met in the churches until a new school was built. But the school district then was, of course, Denton Schools, and was a white school board, and so they decided not to build the school in Quakertown, but to move it basically across town in what we now know as Southeast Denton.
Okay. And was that a push maybe to direct the traffic from Quakertown to that area, you think?
I'm not reading their mind, but I would say yes, that probably was kind of the first push to move away from Quakertown.
Okay. Ms. Clark, and going back through the history of Quakertown, tell the audience what you know about how it first was developed as Freemanstown, and then how it became known as Quakertown, and I guess subsequently what happened to it.
I was told by my husband that in 1875, about 27 families left Dallas and came to Denton County and established Freedman Town. And as I previously stated, they outgrew the area where they were, and then they moved. They found out that they could get a little closer to downtown Denton. Therefore, they moved over in the area now, and when they moved, they renamed it Quakertown. And once they renamed it Quakertown.
And that would have been in the area closer to TWU?
Well, TWU wasn't established.
But what we know today, it would have been that area?
Today, yes.
Okay.
TWU was established several years after they were established. They came over then about 1889, and TWU probably wasn't established till about 1900 or 1901, somewhere along in there.
Ms. Cupit, do you know if TWU was actually up and running at 1901, or were they still discussing?
1901 is actually when they voted in the legislature to establish TWU, but 1903 is when they had their first class in the college, when they built the building and had their first students.
And it was right in that same area
It was
where
right
it is
in the
located
same,
right now?
Yeah, so the first building is actually still there. It's the main building, Old Main in TWU. That was the first building that they built. It was, 2 blocks from where Quakertown is now, or was.
Okay. All right, and we'll get through that. First, let me point out, you shared this with me, Ms. Clark. You actually were interviewed by a UNT student, and this is a recollection of your understanding of history, which can be checked out. Is this in the library?
It's in your
the UNT oral history collection?
Yes.
Okay. Was a video done, or was it simply
taped?
It was taped. Okay. All right. So there's footage of your discussion.
Yeah. But Ms. Cupit says that they do have this book in the museum on the square. Am I correct?
Yes.
So
we have a copy of it as well.
Purchased also.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or you can go to your arts and find it too in your department here on campus.
Okay. So you've been called upon a lot to discuss Denton history.
Yes.
Okay? And I appreciate you coming out today. So where we left off on our discussion, we were talking about the Freeman's becoming Quakertown as a result of the families from Dallas moving down into this area, having more kids, and then the community growing. Is that correct?
Correct.
And then thereby the name becoming Quakertown is how it kind of transitioned from that into Quakertown.
Yes.
So now we're at about 1903. They have a school, Frederick Douglass Elementary School. You've had the Texas legislature voting to open up Texas Women's University, or at the time it was called CIA School, which was in that same community. Did that pose any problem for the people in Denton or for the university regents having the university in the heart of that Quakertown community?
Yes, it did.
What is your understanding of some issues that might have transpired as a result of that?
Well, in order for it was an all-girl school college, white college. In order for them to come to get to downtown Denton, it was necessary for them to come through the community of Quakertown. And they thought that wasn't appropriate for those girls to come through the community. So the president at that time, his name was Bradley, along with the community fathers of Denton, decided, well, maybe it would be best that we disband Quakertown, and because they saw an opportunity that as the school would grow, that it would be more revenue for the town. So, and that's why they got busy and started having meetings to move the residents of Quakertown.
Okay, so you said that the one organization was Fathers of, what did you call them?
The fathers of the city. What I mean,
fathers of the city.
Yes,
okay.
Those are the people that, like we say, the mayor and the city council and all those persons that were leaders of the city.
So we get into the time period of how people were thinking in terms of, you have this black community, you have an all-white female university growing in the middle of the black community, and then the city council, the fathers of the community are beginning to have issues. This is the making of a great story, and I think there are plenty of books written about Quakertown and how things have transpired that way. We're only going to be able to discuss a brief synopsis of that. But so now we're at a point where the fathers of the community are discussing and seeing that maybe we don't want this university growing in this predominantly black community. Their fears from the time probably came to play. Would you say that was probably how it was looked upon, Ms. Cupit?
Oh, definitely. I think it was definitely, a signs of the times. And, we're talking, the late 1910s, early 1920s, which was kind of the height of the KKK in the South. And certainly that the fear of, race riots that were happening all over in 1919 after World War I. So it was certainly the climate that you had in the environment, and I think the president of the college was able to kind of latch on to that fear and that idea in order to get what he wanted, which was the removal of Quakertown and the use of the space.
Okay, so let's talk about how that came to play, the removal of Taper Crown. You mentioned in 1913 there was a mysterious fire at the school. I guess the entire school at that time period.
Yeah,
mysterious
first through
fire.
high school.
Then it was rebuilt, and then the second school was on fire. Did you state that?
No, they just rebuilt the school in another location. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they took care of it quickly. In other words, it mysteriously burnt down, and the next thing you know, their school system is rebuilt in a new area. Would that be the area that we call today Southeast Denton?
Yes. Yeah. It was actually along Y Street, in the area that is now Southeast Denton. So there were, residents that lived over in that area, but clearly not the large group that was in the community of Quakertown.
Okay. Did your husband ever go to school in Southeast Denton?
No, he went while he was in Quakertown. By the time, yes, I guess he did, because he finished his schooling while the school was in Quakertown, because when it burned, I think he had to finish school.
Okay. All right, and they had to relocate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what happened to the businesses? What did they decide they were going to do with the property and the residents who lived in Quakertown?
Well, when they finally, in 1921, held the election that was the demise of Quakertown, the people who owned property and owned businesses were basically given three choices. They could either sell their homes and their land to the city, and the city would tear them down. They could just sell their property, and they could move the houses, and that area that they moved them to was a new platted area called Solomon Hill. Or some of them chose to sell, and they just left it. So the doctor left, Dr. Moten left. The family that ran the grocery store and the undertaking business, they left and moved out of town. There were a couple of ministers that basically chose to leave rather because they were outspoken of the situation and because they had been threatened to leave. So it was kind of, you could move the house, which is how we ended up with several houses that are still. We now know of two that still exist to this day, but many of them were just torn down, and people had to relocate. Some of them relocated in Denton, some of them left altogether.
Okay. When you say they were torn down, does that mean that they sold, or do you, at the time were they, you were given the options, and I guess today we would know that to be like eminent domain when the government is going to seize your property. At that time, do you have any information about if they were even given value for their property?
They were not given value for their property. So their property did not get what it was worth. I'm talking, a house and value that they were getting, $1,200, and that was it. It's clearly, some of them fought and tried to get more for their property, and they were unsuccessful. Those who did fight and did not sell it outright, the city just condemned the property.
Okay, so they waited too late and they ended up with nothing.
Nothing.
So then they were forced to disperse to, I guess, whatever location they could at that point.
Yeah, a rancher by the name of A.L. Miles, he had a cattle pasture that he needed to unload, basically. And so he kind of jumped on that opportunity and platted out the land. And this is what is now kind of the area that is on East Hickory and East Oak Street. Kind of where Ms. Clark lives now, and he platted out that land, and so many of the residents of Quakertown moved their houses there, and it was literally kind of, you know, on the other side of the tracks. It was no longer close to the universities where they worked. You know, people had to travel. They also, Quakertown had electricity. It didn't have sewer or anything like that, but Solomon Hill, which was the area that they moved to, was actually downwind of the city sewer. And it didn't have the improvements that Quakertown had. It was literally a converted cow pasture that they moved their houses to.
Without the electricity or
Without the
ability.
electricity, the streets weren't paved until the 1960s.
Okay. Ms. Clark, you said you were here since 63?
62.
62, okay. And when you moved here, do you think the black community was still recovering from that, or were they at a point where they were thriving?
They were thriving, but to my surprise, many of them that lived in the black community was unaware of what had happened to Quakertown, because what few families that remained, they didn't discuss it. And the only reason why I knew so much about it is that my husband would tell me all the time, because we'd have to go to City Hall. In City Hall right now, up one portion of it, the one that's called City Hall that's on McKinney Street, that was part of Quakertown. The post office, the civic building, the senior building, the women's building, and the library. Also the swimming pool. So each time that we would go to any of those places, he would begin to tell me about Quakertown. Where the swimming pool is now, the house that he grew up in and that our children grew up in was in the vicinity of where the swimming pool is now.
Okay, by the Civic Center.
By the senior building.
Right, right.
And he began to tell the stories. But the other people that were not a part of Quakertown, black and white, they knew very little about what had happened to Quakertown.
Okay. And so that brings us to, you know, why do we still have these discussions, and why do we talk about it in February, and why is it important to understand your history? You have had a very thriving black community in Denton, almost self-contained within itself. And during that time period, because of that time period, one could probably argue, you know, it was dismantled.
It was.
Do you think that perhaps the black community in Denton now has not seen the likes of that type of success or prosperity since Quakertown?
Yes, I do.
And it's important to note that it has existed before, and so that you can get there again. It's a little different southeast of Denton today than perhaps Quakertown was then. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
All right, well, we're getting to the point where we call our closing statement. We used to call it closing argument, but we're just kind of making a statement and having a conversation. And I'm going to start with Ms. Cupit and give you about a minute or so and talk with the viewers about anything that you think might be interesting about the museum, about some of the history that we've discussed, and where they can go if they want to find out more about Quakertown.
Well, I think one thing, somebody asked me, why do we study Quakertown? And I think one of the important things that we teach, and we also teach the children that come through our museum, because we have a lot of the school tours is, we learn from Quakertown so we don't repeat Quakertown. You learn from, past mistakes, and you must study the bad in order to appreciate the good. And you must, study the bad so you don't repeat the bad. And I think that's an important thing to kind of learn from, the history of what happened to the community, so that we don't repeat anything similar that happens. Quakertown is an important part of our interpretation at the museum. We have, our museum that we're devoted to it. We're excited about. We're getting an extra house. We also have specialized tours that seventh graders go on, that just focuses on the history of Quakertown.
Right, and I'm sure it's a revelation to them to know
it
that
is
such a community
incredibly
like
a revolution from that, and something kind of not understanding how can the government take your house.
Right.
And I remind them that hey, Arlington, those people's houses were taken to build Cowboy Stadium.
Right.
And so that
we'll touch on that. I'll touch on that as we're closing. Miss Clark, I'll give you a minute to let the viewers know anything that maybe you weren't able to discuss or bring out regarding Quakertown and your history with it.
Well, I'm just disappointed that my children didn't have an opportunity to experience, because by the time they were old enough to go to school, the schools had integrated, and their father didn't talk much to them about it, because, as he would often say, it put a bad taste in his mouth. So therefore, he wanted to forget the bad occurrence. And what we impressed with our children is to go and be the best citizen you can, and get an education and prepare yourself for what had transpired, that wouldn't happen again.
Exactly.
And so they were all blessed to go to the integrated school, and then we're all blessed to go to the integrated colleges.
Right.
Our daughter attended TW and got her first degree there.
That's awesome.
So, because he wanted to leave it be, since it was very distasteful.
Right, and I can understand that. Well, we're getting to the closing moment where I'll take what's called the final argument, and I do want to thank my guests for coming, Miss Cupit and Miss Alma Clark, kind of our living museum person who can give us a living history of that. Kind of coming here through your husband and absorbing all of that information firsthand. I really appreciate you coming. And Miss Cupit giving us some of the information that you have that you present to people at the Denton Museum, that they can come and discuss that. And one thing you mentioned was we learn about Quakertown because we want to make sure we don't repeat the past, and that we all are educated on what happened. And as you stated before, that continues to happen today. It's important to go to your city council meetings. The issue of eminent domain, your county commissioners are dealing with those issues today. You want to make sure that you are informed about what the government is doing, because it boils down to the government taking property. We do allow them that authority for reasons that are necessary, but you want to make sure you understand what's going on at those meetings, and that's why it's important to attend those meetings and to get educated, and might I add, to vote. So, Delia Parker Mims for Access to Justice, thank you.